Thank you for joining us today for this very important webinar that we are co-hosting with EY on leveraging public-private partnerships for renewable energy development in Africa. To start us off, I'd like to invite Darren Grimsey, who is EY's Global Infrastructure Advisory Leader in Strategy and Transactions. Darren has 35 years of experience working in infrastructure, and he's recently published several academic journals and books dealing with PPPs. Darren, over to you to deliver opening remarks.
Well, thanks very much, Shamini, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for joining this very important webinar. And thank you to the World Bank and the panelists. We've got a tremendous set of panelists for you today who will be discussing the issues with public-private partnerships for renewable energy and development in Africa. And it's also an opportunity for the World Bank and presenters to present their recent paper entitled How to Unlock Pipelines of Bankable Renewable Energy Projects in Energy Markets and Developing Economies. At EY, we have a very large consulting business in infrastructure where we focus on sustainable infrastructure, and we have PPP advisory teams all around the world who help our clients, multilateral development banks. They help our government clients, also our private sector clients, in designing, developing and implementing PPPs, right from policy, investment appraisal, procurement, transactions and contract management. We use a hub and spoke model whereby we can bring in specialists from centres around the world, London, Melbourne, Singapore, New York. All of these centres have specialists that can fly in and support local teams on the ground. I just want to take a bit of a step back and look at the big picture here. There is a need to accelerate the energy mix transition to mitigate the impacts of climate change. I think we all accept that. Aside from India and China, clean energy spending in emerging and developing markets remains stuck at 2015 levels, unfortunately. These markets represent 20% of all global energy investment, where public funding accounts for around half of that energy investment. A higher cost of capital and rising borrowing costs, together with competition from leading renewable markets, make it even more challenging for these countries in emerging and developing economies to attract private investment. There is a need to accelerate the investment. That means we need to adapt our current tools for financing, for creating the regulatory environment, for building institutions to facilitate this participation. With limited government capacities, PPPs have a major role to play. I myself are currently involved in providing infrastructure advice throughout Southeast Asia, where we are focusing on building capacity to be able to deliver PPPs in country. Recently, having just been on mission to Cambodia to support them with their renewable energy their task and to utilise PPPs in that market. At EY, we assist governments, companies and utilities providing economic, financial and strategic advice to pick the right projects and procure and manage them through to completion. We published the Renewable Energy Country Attractiveness Index report that ranks the attractiveness of countries in renewable energy investment. So, it aims to present an assessment of a country's overall ability to attract capital for renewable energy companies and projects. And some of the statistics that I've been quoting in these introductory remarks are taken directly from that report. Once again, I'd like to thank the World Bank and the panelists today for what I'm sure will be a very interesting exploration of this market. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to this discussion. Thank you very much, Shamini.
Thank you, Darren. So for clearly framing today's conversation, we need all stakeholders to accelerate actions to meet our energy transition goals. Now I'd like to look forward to invite Claire Nicholas, who is SRMI's co-lead and a senior economist at World Bank. Claire, over to you to present our paper.
Thanks a lot, Shamini, and let me know if you're not seeing my slides. So as Shamini indicated, I'm going to present briefly a recent paper that with the SRMI partners we published on how to unlock pipelines of bankable renewable energy projects in emerging markets and developing countries. And so, we started from the fact that after the COP28, there is a clear commitment from the global community to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. And while RE scale-up has been going crazy in the world recently, driven by declining costs, when we look at developing countries, in reality, except for China and India, those two countries are a bit the trees hiding the forest being lots of countries without any renewable energy investments. And so we often hear that the problem is the availability of private financing and the fact that developers are not willing to go into developing countries to deploy and develop renewable energy projects. But when we have discussions with them, they're really keen to join and to develop projects in those countries. But what is missing from their perspective is a pipeline of bankable projects. And so when we started working on these papers, the question was why are pipelines of bankable projects so scarce in many developing countries? And so we started by identifying the barriers to the pipeline deployment in most emerging markets and developing economies. And the first one that we identified was the absence of a medium or long-term vision and the absence of commitments that would be able to trickle down to the implementing institutions or implementing agencies of the energy transition. The second barrier is the inadequate or missing regulatory framework, particularly with regards to the participation of the private sectors to the generation and the transmission sectors, and also to the possibility for the utility or for off-takers to launch competitive tenders. This point is a big barrier to the deployment of pipelines of renewable projects, and the fact that in many developing countries, bilateral deals are still the norms, and that it's very difficult to launch competitive and transparent procurement processes with obviously the issues of corruption and of high prices that are the results of bilateral deals in general. The fourth point, and it's a point that is very important in many developing countries, is the fact that a lot of the off-takers and the off-taker being the utility in general are not credit-worthy, and so there is a big risk for the developers. The fifth point is one that colleagues at the bank know very well, and it's the fact that grids are usually insufficient or unreliable, which creates a very high curtailment risk for the developers. And finally, as you all know, renewable energy is really capex intensive, and because of foreign exchange risk and issue, and because of the lack of domestic lending markets, the foreign exchange risk is a big risk. And so once the barriers have been identified, we tried to propose solutions to these challenges. And so it's a bit obvious, but what is very important from the government is to adopt commitments and have a long-term vision that will give confidence to the investors. And what is absolutely critical is that the commitments are not only taken by the government, but really trickle down to the utility. In many countries, we saw the government announce big renewable energy targets, but in reality, the utility was not involved, and so it did not work really well. Like for example, Senegal is a case where the commitment to reach 40% of renewable energy by 2030 has been discussed in depth between the government and the utilities and all the power sector actors. And so it's a commitment that is kind of credible by the investors. Then, obviously, it's really important to establish a stable and comprehensive regulatory framework, like what has been done, for example, in Burkina Faso in these past years with the establishment of a PPP law. Developing competitive and transparent procurement processes have huge impact. Scaling solar has had very good success in, for example, Senegal and the Zambia. I mean, we all know it's very important to develop the grid. Without a strong grid, there will be no scale up of viable renewable energy. And so ensuring that the utility is able to put in place the right analysis to do the planning, and that the utilities is going to be able to invest in the grid and grid support solution is absolutely critical. And that, for example, is something that the bank worked a lot in the West African power pool, both on the storage part, so trying to work on a regional storage program, but also on interconnections between countries to increase the reliability of the West African grid and to accelerate renewable energy scale-up. It's really important, as mentioned previously, to work on foreign exchange issues, because, for example, in Ethiopia, they worked on the regulatory framework. They have a long-term vision. They were able to launch competitive and transparent procurement processes, but unfortunately, a lack of dollars in the central bank is blocking the whole pipeline of renewable energy projects. And so that's something that the World Bank team, the World Bank group, is working on with Ethiopia to try to find solutions using reimbursable grants to unlock a few of the renewable energy projects that are currently in the pipeline. And finally, it's really also important to improve the creditworthiness of the off-taker by implementing power sector reform and sometimes project-specific risk mitigation measures to reduce the off-taker risk, which is something that we are working on currently in Sao Tome and Principe, because the utility, like creditworthiness and ability to pay, is quite low. And so through a capex buy-down mechanism, the idea is to reduce the future PPA price and ensure that it will be a price that will be sustainable for the utility. One last word, because before I give the floor back to Shamini on SRMI, so the Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative, under which we aim to really tackle all the challenges that were described just before through technical assistance, both upstream to tackle, for example, all the grid risks, through planning support, integration analysis, the regulatory risks, and so on, but also downstream technical assistance through transaction advisory support and feasibility studies to accelerate the deployment of renewable, but also through risk mitigation instrument and through the World Bank lending arm, the possibility of financing critical public investments. So you're seeing on the slides all the SRMI partners that have been collaborating to this knowledge piece, but also are working on a daily basis under SRMI. Shamini, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for clearly laying out the challenges between ambition and getting to reality, and sort of setting the framework for our panel that is coming up. So I'd love to invite our panelists now. Our first panelist is Sabine Cornietti, Senior Energy Specialist and the co-lead of SRMI World Bank. Alexis Gazzo, who is a partner, Climate Change and Sustainability Services at EY. Osman Diwara, Director at Infrastructure Advisory at EY. And Abdoulaye Director, Financial Bankability, New Renewable Energy Technologies, Africa at QAir. Thank you all for joining us today. Both Darren and Claire have set the framework for, or set the stage for our discussions. And now I'd like to go to each of you because you bring different areas of expertise on this conversation that we're going to have. First, Sabine, I'll go to you to kick off. Claire sort of touched on this as she ended her presentation, but could you elaborate on how the Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative, SRMI, is specifically addressing the risks associated with renewable energy projects in Africa to make them more attractive to private investors?
Thank you very much, Amini. And indeed, I'll be complementing what Claire presented. But SRMI was created a while back now in 2018 because we felt that we had a lot of simple ideas and simple solutions for very complex constraints that we're facing. Renewables are not happening or not happening to the scale needed in most countries. As Claire mentioned, we have incredible gigawatts and objectives and things that are happening in the news every day, but very rarely you're going to hear about the few projects that happen in the sub-Saharan African country and continents. So it's important to have a tailored support with tailored strategy for each country. It's not a continent-wide solution that we can provide. It's really tailored proposal. The second bit on SRMI is about collaboration between MDBs, multilateral development banks. Claire mentioned the fact that we were working on providing also financial support through loans, but it's not just the World Bank, it's also the African Development Bank, the French Development Agency, EBRD is coming in as well, and all of us together are supporting financially the public needs for public investments, in particular for the grid, while trying to really leverage expertise such as EY's on technical expertise support that we need to allow for the right type of expertise to come in, the capacity being quite weak in some of the client countries we have. We need to have the right people in the room to think with us, brainstorm, and provide some long-term solutions that would work for the country. And with all that, that's SRMI. So we provide all this support. But for example, if we take Burkina Faso that Claire mentioned, and under which we actually worked quite a bit with Ousmane, who's on the panel as well. We have a very complex country. It's a country which has a very weak grid, a country with low capacity, a country that has political constraints, and but it's also a success story. It has around 200 megawatts of IPP projects that are getting paid every month, and they're trying to launch new tenders, and all that to reduce the cost of generation, which has been drastically reduced thanks to the IPP projects. And facing this political and regulatory constraints. So through technical assistance, we had been providing legal support, so through the new PPP law, and also through transaction advisory support, for which, for example, what we worked on with EY was the idea on how to use for the off-taker risk, have back-to-back PPAs, power purchase agreements, with mines as bankable off-takers. So really thinking about innovative ways through this technical assistance. Public investments with the African Development Bank, we've been financing major interconnections, backbones, and grid reinforcements, and in general, launching tenders. So we're about to launch a tender in Burkina with some specific supports, such as, for example, the fact that, of course, everybody knows Burkina has security issues, and we're providing land security support from the government through solar parks and the army being present. So it's not an easy country, but it's a good example of things that we've been doing. It's a long-term support. We've been working on Burkina for years now, and it's not a quick win, but it's definitely a success at this point. Back to you, Shamini.
Thanks, Sabine. My next question is to Alexi. Alexi, you've been doing this for about 20 years and have expertise working on energy transition. Could you tell me what, from your experience, what the main challenges are in aligning private sustainability goals with public renewable energy objectives, and how you encourage governments to adopt long-term renewable energy commitments?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Minnie, and hi everyone. So I'm Alexis Gazo. I'm a partner at EY. I'm based in France, and I focus on sustainability and climate. And I have worked repeatedly with World Bank, mostly in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa around energy transition. And to your question, Shamini, I think that one of the points that we do see when you talk about this question of aligning private sector developers with governmental targets is really about what Claire said and her first item, which is about defining a long-term horizon, a long-term roadmap for energy transition. This is really key to provide visibility to private sector investors or developers. And so that's part of the task that we assist on, basically to support World Bank in its discussions with governments to shape this long-term plan, this long-term roadmap. This is what we have done with Namibia, Botswana, Jordan, Morocco, many other countries. Well, the points on which we discuss with governments really are about a few key items. One is climate. How does the government's NDC, so its climate targets, climate commitment, is going to translate into energy transition targets, at what pace, at what horizon. Interestingly, now there's a number of countries in the regions I've mentioned which have set very ambitious targets, as ambitious as what we see in the most developed countries. Morocco, Tunisia, they have targets now of reducing by 45% their greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. These are conditional. It's conditional to the access to concessional finance. So it's also interesting to see this conditionality, I would say, that is set. But anyway, very, very bold targets. These have been, restated at COP28 in Dubai. We'll wait to see at COP30 in Brazil how the new NDCs might become even more ambitious. And I think this fits also with the goal that Claire mentioned about the Dubai consensus to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030 globally. So there's a big momentum around it. So obviously climate is the first item. The second item is energy security. That's a huge issue for a number of governments that we assist. You have a variety of situations, of course, depending on the local resources available. It's not a big surprise that countries like Morocco, who are basically energy importers, started quite early in their transition to renewable energy. Basically, it kicked off with the Moroccan solar plan in 2000, which followed a spike in global oil prices. So it was it caused a very big surge in energy imports for Morocco, and it really catalyzed this Moroccan solar plan. But other countries like Jordan have also been forced, I would say, to envisage the diversification of their mix because of their dependency to imports. And other countries who have domestic resources can also face similar situations. I mean, Namibia, even if they have a lot of hydro and coal, they are depending for 70% of electricity imports to South Africa. So obviously, diversification and energy security is key. If you take Tunisia, 90% of electricity generation, is based on gas, and now more than half of this gas is now imported from Algeria and not anymore produced domestically. So there again, switching to new domestic sources like renewable energy is key for energy security. The other point is affordability. How do you ensure that your energy sources are going to be competitive? And that's where, doing long-term energy planning, analyzing the LCOE, so the levelized cost of energy of different sources, is quite critical to see what kind of options governments have And obviously, it's quite difficult to be able to both discuss long-term infrastructure plans with the fluctuations of, energy technologies in the short term. We do see very strong dynamics in technologies like storage, for example, where prices are coming down fast. And we also see sometimes contradictory signals with, recently the rise of inflation, the increased cost of equipments for wind, which has been quite strong. In the first semester of this year, wind equipment increased by something like 50%. So, you can have very big surges in prices on the short term. And all this, I think, adds confusion to decision makers. And our role is to be able, to bring clarity on the long-term trends and on, what can be the no-regret solutions, the solutions that can be based on the, I would say, best available data we have. So again, building these, I would say, robust models and anticipating different variations is quite key. The other, I think, points that fall into the discussion are about the capacity to build an industry. Come back to that maybe in a minute. But how developing a number of renewable energy sources can lead to more local employment, to more local jobs, to industrial development, to skills development. All this, can be obviously a very attractive proposition for governments. And there are success stories. I mentioned Morocco, I think, which is one. There are other countries which have managed to attract investments, to attract factories and job creation. And maybe the last point is also the fact of accessing concessional finance. I think in some cases, the case for deploying a renewable energy roadmap is also based on the fact that these projects can attract different sources of cheap capital, of concessional funding. And that's where also, our role is to try to put all these items together to, I would say, try to clarify a picture which is quite complex, but obviously where we do need to have this long-term vision if we do want to bring clarity to investors and developers. So thanks, Jamini.
Thank you, Alexi. I really appreciate you taking all the different pieces of this puzzle and framing it for us. And I really loved how you did that, starting with NDCs, which I think sometimes is forgotten as some technical thing, but really, as you said, it is key to translate to these energy roadmaps, which goes into all the other things that you talked about. Now, going from that government side to the private sector side, Abdoulaye, I'm going to go to you. As a developer working in Africa, could you share some insights into some key barriers that you've encountered while, trying to develop projects in Africa? What are some things that have hindered your progress?
Yes, thank you, Shamini. Hi, everyone. I'm very delighted to participate in this webinar. We heard the view from the MDB's World Bank and also from EY. So I think earlier Claire touched upon some of the key barriers in that the report is developing. As a developer, I would not emphasize on many of them, but I would pick two of them, which for me are essential to scale up renewable energy development in Africa. And the first one, I think it's not appearing on the top of the list, but it's, I think, a necessary condition, but not sufficient, which is the development of grid infrastructure. Of course, Africa has been known for it's close to 600 million of the population not having yet access to electricity, but also a strong potential of renewable energies, such as solar. I think solar Africa has almost 60% of the best irradiation in the world, but accounts only for 1% of renewable solar investment. In 2022, also, out of the 500 billion of renewable energy investment in the world, Africa accounts for less than 3%. So these figures are alarming and shows that Africa is lagging behind access to electricity, which is mainly also due to that lack of development of the grid. This is a key barrier, which explains totally why today we are seeing this development of electricity in Africa. This is not specific to Africa. I think for renewable energy development around the world, grid capacity has also to ramp up and meet the required integration of the renewable energies. But for Africa, of course, it's more visible because many times also in developing projects, we have been impacted by this less development of the grid. I will give you one example in Burkina Faso. I think it has been mentioned a lot earlier. So CARE contributed also to the success story in Burkina. We have 2 projects. So the first one is already operational. And the second one, which was supposed to close at the same time or a few months after the first one, has been delayed due to this grid lack of grid infrastructure. Actually, the second project was depending on the realization of a new substation, which experienced quite important delays. And at the time we were supposed to close the financing, the grid was not there. So we waited for the 2 years from 2022. At the same time, we began to experience all the rising interest rate and also all the global inflation on the equipment cost, which jeopardized totally the implementation of the project. But the good news is now the conditions are much better, not yet the financing, but we are able to secure additional financing to make the project viable. So I think grid infrastructure development is key and paramount to scale up renewable energy development, because without that development, we will not be able also to integrate any energy in the grid. And the second one also, I think, which is the most painful maybe barrier that all developers experience in Africa, is related also to what has been said earlier, the weak creditworthiness of many off-takers in Africa. I think few countries can propose IPP projects without any support of the government. So dealing with off-taker risk is really painful in some countries. We cannot only rely on the creditworthiness of taker. We have to step up and request some state support, which can be in several forms, from sovereign guarantees, or also some additional support from MDBs such as World Bank with the PRD instruments. So that's the process is quite complex and not widely accessible to seek some government support or also World Bank PRD instruments. So I think one of the key aspect also to look at in this exercise to scale renewable energy development is also to develop widely accessible credit enhancement tools to cope with all the difficulties of utilities and in some cases also of the states. So I think I will just shorten on those 2 points, which to me are representing the most impactful in our development activities.
Thank you, Abdoulaye, for sharing some of the challenges. I mean, the grid that you mentioned is quite key, but the one point that you mentioned that would be a key takeaway for us from the World Bank is the complexity and accessibility of mitigation instruments and guarantees. So thank you for raising that. Now back over to EY. Ousmane, my question to you is, How can governments establish effective IPP, PPP regulatory frameworks and procurement strategy to expedite and facilitate renewable energy project development? This is sort of the flip side of the main concern that Abdoulaye sort of raised in his response.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Shamini. Good day, all, and thank you for the invitation today. Sorry. To answer your question, for sure, having an effective PPP regulatory framework is key to support the acceleration of renewable energy projects. The World Bank Group, especially PPIF and other donors, have played a key role during the last 15 or 20 years to develop those regulatory frameworks across the African continent, together with a strong support to the development of PPP units. In many countries, needed legislations and administrations are in place, but they need to practice more to expedite the PPP projects in development. I recently held a workshop with the PPP unit of Madagascar in Paris. They have a PPP law in place since 2015, but only very few PPP projects were launched and closed since then. I was very surprised during the workshop that most of the PPP unit members didn't have any real life experience conducting a PPP transaction hand to hand. They already had many capacity building sessions. They have already made several study trips with other PPP units in Africa or in Europe, but there is a strong lack on learning by doing. I faced a similar challenge recently in Benin. I advised the Ministry of Energy for almost 5 years, and Benin has also a PPP law in force since 2016. We launched 60 megawatt peak solar PV IPP tender back in 2019, and we were the first one using the PPP law in the country at the moment. So everyone was learning by doing on this project. That was a very efficient way to make a proof of concept that the law is working, but we needed to find the right way to operationalize the various concepts, approval ladders on the ground. It implied many back and forth between the various administrations and demonstrated the huge interest having a strong project pipeline to streamline the overall process. And I think it's something mentioned in the position paper. A successful pilot doesn't make a pipeline. The position paper is focusing on renewable, but if we think about PPP and infra in those countries, there is a need to have a sufficient number of PPPs, live PPP projects, to ensure we have a lively community of practitioners in a given country. Another example, perhaps, we are currently advising the Gambia, the national authorities of the Gambia, for a solar PV plus battery storage IPP project, thanks to the support of the World Bank Group and the West African Power Pool. The Gambia updated their PPP law in 2022 with quite large amendments compared to the previous law. So we had to spend time with the various administrations to explain the changes introduced by the new law, and especially how it impacts the way of working they have previously developed. So in a nutshell, and through those three examples, I think the acceleration of renewable energy projects development through IPP/PPP is strongly linked to the pre-existence of a stable regulatory framework in line with international best practices, especially regarding bankability considerations, and with a robust project pipeline, renewable but not only, to ensure we have a lively community of practitioners within those countries, to ensure we have streamlined and fast processes when using PPP as to develop those infrastructures.
Thank you, Usman, for clearly outlining some of those interconnected steps. I'm going to go to Sabine next because some of the examples that you shared, I think Sabine can also come in on. But my question to you, Sabine, is what are some lessons learned, touching on what Usman said, from the recent World Bank supported renewable energy projects under PPP models in Africa that could be applied to future projects on the continent?
Thank you very much, Amini, and yeah, fully agree with what Usman just said, and actually Abdullah as well. I mean, the fact that you have the right legislation in place, which is already a big win, doesn't actually mean that it's going to be easy to implement. Having some sort of capacity building program doesn't mean they're going to have the expertise. And then the credit enhancement mechanisms, we have amazing tools in the at the bank, in all the MDBs, we have guarantees, credit enhancement mechanisms. We're trying to develop some new innovative tools, but the reality is it's not that easy to get them, and it's also fixing a problem which sometimes is just not that easy to fix. Like, for example, we're discussing with the Nigerian government now, and they are transforming now their market in the process of unbundling completely their utility. And the reality is that in the vision of the perfect market, you will not need any backstop from the government anymore. And this is something that basically they've heard all their lives. We've been telling them, you need to unbundle, this is something good for you. And so they're actually taking it literally. They're like, okay, we don't need to provide a government guarantee anymore, no backstop. And the problem is that we can't go that fast. And that's a big lessons learned, is that governments are needed. Ownership from the government is needed. We can't let the utility by themselves, even if the discos and privatized. In the end, you still need the government buy-in. The fact that you have expropriation or change in law that are risks that the government still needs to keep in. This is not something that we can give to anybody else to take as the risk, because it's not under the IPP purview or even the DISCO purview. It's really about the government. So I think that's one big lessons learned that we're trying to communicate also to our clients, so governments, saying you can't just disappear from the deal. You need to be there. Another big lessons learned is related also to ownership, and that's another project we work on with EY. It's in Algeria. Ownership means also understanding, the path into energy transition, and it's actually very funny because they have a lot of gas, and the other day we were on mission there, and they told us, well, yeah, we're transitioning. We're using the transition fuel. We're using gas. And, in a way, yeah, well, officially everybody is speaking about gas as the transitioning fuel, but this is not a transition because they have a lot of gas forever. And it's, for me, the big lessons learned also on how we're presenting it is, there's a lot of noise around on, what it means to transition. And we need to adapt what we're proposing to our client countries, really tailored to what they are facing, and ensuring that the way we are presenting it is completely encompassing all of the challenges of the sector. And you can't just say to a country like Algeria, just switch to solar tomorrow, when most of the economy is based on gas. And so that's a key aspect to presenting it to multiple countries. Another one would be just on Ethiopia, which was also a bit mentioned by Claire, and also related to credit enhancement mechanisms. It is important to launch a tender with the right instruments. We know, and we've all read in the news, amazing solar prices in Ethiopia, and then this project never closed. And why it never closed is because we didn't have the right risk mitigation instrument. And because some IPPs decided that they could find a way to get that key risk on foreign exchange fixed after providing a price, which was a very, very low price, an amazing price, but then they never reached financial close. And so I think this is also, between the experts and us at the bank, this is something we need to really be very conscious about, that we cannot just let IPPs also be too cowboyish sometimes. And we have very, very good, strong IPPs that are not cowboyish. And so I think this is also a discussion that we need to have and create between the public and the private sector to make sure that, you know, whatever proposal will be on the table will materialize. Because this gives a very bad name and reputation to everybody else then and to any tenders that comes after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I think that you were really pragmatic in addressing some of the practical challenges that are being faced. And while you were speaking, there were multiple questions around FX risks that showed up on the chat. So it's clearly on many people's mind as well. Alexi, I'm going to come back to you now. You know, picking up on some of the threads in this conversation we've been having so far, how can PPP frameworks be optimized to not only deliver socioeconomic benefits to meet the technical and financial expectations of private investors, but also to engage governments, institutions, and civil society in a productive dialogue for renewable energy policies? You sort of touched on this in your initial answer, but perhaps expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I mean, it is clear for me that, you know, being able to show the perspective to create a local industry, a local sector around the energy transition, you know, green value chains, if we are able to do that, is highly desirable to accelerate the climate transition, the energy transition in the country. Obviously, this needs to be supported by skills development. It needs appropriate financing schemes. But it's really going to be a way to secure local acceptance and government support, I would say. So, I mean, for all these reasons, I think it's really important to do it. And the way we've seen it in the different projects that we have been involved in is really around being able to understand, you know, as Sabine said, understand the local context. I mean, not all countries have the same economies. They don't have the same industry structure, the same specialties. Some countries may be very good already in electrical equipment, for example, so that can be a basis on which you can build, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding the local context is key. Trying to be able to, I would say, see where on the different technologies that you are deploying based on your LCOE analysis, you can have bigger opportunities, you know, to, for example, focus on the O&M sector. You know, typically you can have more local involvement in O&M for wind, for example, than solar, because wind is a bit more complicated to maintain and to operate than solar is. So, you know, all these aspects I think are quite key. And obviously, you know, again, building on the energy sector itself. You know, if you have an energy sector like Namibia, where conventional power generation, coal-based in part, is already quite strong, it can be a basis on which you can transfer skills that you know, are already in the market, but that you need to adapt and transfer. So when we work on these projects, we really focus on items that are going to develop the renewable energy market, and these elements are around formulating a long-term strategy. We've touched upon that, ideally with technology-specific targets. So that's the focus really on the development, you know, in terms of capacity of each technology, and that gives you a pipeline, that gives you a horizon for developers. Focusing on regulation and permitting is going to be key. Focusing on transmission and distribution infrastructure, and on other flexibility solutions. All this is going to be able to give you a roadmap to develop the market, which is obviously the background on which you can then build an industry. And then the second aspect is really to improve the conditions for local players, local operators to get involved in this transition. And that's going to be around how you phase the size and complexity of projects so that you can ramp up the inclusion of local players. Maybe having local contents rules. Many countries have done that. What we've seen, for example, in Namibia, is that for solar PV, you can quite quickly move from targets that are going to be from 20% to 30% of local content for solar, and maybe from 20 to 40% for wind, because of this O&M aspect I mentioned. So you can, you know, quite quickly build a roadmap to increase quite substantially local contents. And some countries like Morocco, you know, they're aiming for 60% in some cases of local content. The other aspects are going to be around skills development. It's a huge issue, and we've worked actually with the bank on how to ramp up skills for energy transition in a variety of MENA countries. And then obviously the last point is around financing. How do you, and that's really your job, World Bank Group, is to develop the adequate financing tools that are going to be able to finance not only projects, but also industrial development around it or skills development. And I'd like to give the example of the solar cluster in Morocco, which was developed by Mazen with World Bank support. It really created a lot of awareness across the industry on how to get involved in solar, and a lot of support to build capacities, build training on these projects. So thanks, Shamini.
Thank you, Alexi. I appreciate you talking about all the different enabling environments and ending with the easiest challenge, the finance piece in your response. I'm going to go back to Abdoulaye from a private sector perspective in terms of what sort of critical factors determine the bankability of renewable energy projects, in Africa, and what solutions or approaches through PPPs, from your experience, do you recommend to overcome these challenges so that development can be scaled up?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think from what we all heard here in this conversation and learned, I think it appears that in Africa, of course, the renewable energy development is somehow locked, and we need to unlock it. And I will give you 3 points, which I think if you work on this, we'll be able to unlock the potential of renewable energy in Africa. So the password stands in 2 words, GDP in French. GDP in French means PIB, PIB. So the P for me stands for programmatic approach. It means that we will not seek to develop one single project or some few projects. I think that's the case in many countries. We start, of course, with the first renewable energy project and then see how to expand. But we should develop a programmatic, government should develop a programmatic approach. I think it has been also mentioned earlier, which means that they will draw clear energy policies, which will also means that they have clear targets and ambitions on renewable energy integration by setting megawatts or gigawatts to be reached within a certain horizon. But also it means that the development should work on setting the right regulatory framework to allow those projects to get off the ground. So it also means that government should work on the planning of all those projects, which also means they should work also on the first one I mentioned earlier, the grid expansion plan, to afford also the integration of the renewable energy capacities. So these are key for the private sector, because without any clear target and ambitious program, it's very difficult to mobilize a private sector interest in any country. So the programmatic approach is the first element, and the second one, Alexi mentioned it just earlier, it's about the inclusion. Inclusion for me is key. We experience in some countries where all the public stakeholders are involved and feel they have a part to play in the development of the renewable energy project. It was very efficient. Burkina Faso is one of the examples. There was strong commitment from the utility to secure lands. Being aware also of all the ENH issues, we were really amazed of how they secure the land, considering also that factor, and also the grid, as I mentioned, but unfortunately there was some delays. But their commitment and their ownership of the program was key to get that successful results. And we should not limit also the inclusion to the utility. All the public or ministries departments involved in the project should be there to work in coordination to simplify or fast track the permitting process and get authorizations on time. Sometimes we struggle at the end of the development to secure one final authorization, but it can be also blocking the financial close. So I think all the state departments involved should be involved and play their role and work together and own the program to deliver all the gigawatt or megawatt needed. And the last point, the last point is B. It stands for the bankability, of course, which is also a key element. As I mentioned earlier, we really need continuous effort from all the MDBs around maybe redesigning their credit enhancement tools, but also try to increase the availability of those instruments and simplify the process for private sector to get those instruments to deliver on the renewable energy projects. And if you give us the PIB,
I'm sorry. Thank you for making those points. We are going to be quickly running out of time. So I think that if you want to
that's only what we need. You give the
okay, because you've been very articulate in identifying the challenges and what needs to be done. And, you know, you are the kind of people we need to keep sort of sounding the alarm. So I have one last question for our panelists, and then I'm going to welcome Chandra, who is the practice manager at ESMAP, to deliver closing remarks. My last question to you is to Usman. So we've talked quite a bit and covered lots of different issues, challenges, how we can overcome them. So the last question to you is, what strategies can we use to minimize the perceived cost of capital and address government reluctance towards PPPs? Because that is another challenge we did not talk about. So I'll let you respond to that.
Perhaps regarding the reluctance towards PPPs, I think the time to market of those projects is way too long. It's the first reason why you have, on one hand, a reduced appetite from the private sector and the correlatively higher cost of capital. And it's also a bottleneck for governments, on the other hand, as they are often considering these PPP processes too long and too complex compared to traditional public procurements, which they are much more familiar with. So to solve this issue, they need to practice, and they need to have this sufficient and robust pipeline of projects to be much more familiar with the PPP procurement process. If going back to how to minimize the perceived risks and reduce the cost of capital, I think there is a very good illustrative in the position paper released by SRMI, highlighting the 5 or 6 key factors to reduce this cost of capital. First, secure the land, conduct the ESIA studies, and deliver all the permits. Why not directly within the tender package? That's a way to reduce the perceived risk by the private sector. Run transparent and competitive tender to ensure the competitiveness of prices. Have a solution to mitigate the FX risk with a PPA labeled in hard currency or an indexation mechanism put in place to cover this risk. You can also think about other solutions to cover FX risk, but that are the main ones and easiest one to put in place currently in the market. Work with the governments to provide contractual support to cover political and off-taker risks. I think it was also mentioned by many of the other panelists, including using third-party risk mitigation instruments like SRMI risk mitigation instruments, RLSF, or other guarantees provided by the various donors. And finally, I think it's important to be fast and fail fast. it's not possible to be 100% successful on project development, sorry. If we have a project which is a dead end, public authorities should have the courage to abort a project as soon as possible, analyze the failure, and repackage it if needed.
Thank you, Usman, for wrapping us up with your insights. This webinar is happening on the heels of the World Bank spring meetings, which took place last week. There was quite a lot of attention on both energy transition and on Africa. And so I'd like to invite to deliver closing remarks Chandrasekhar Govindarajulu, who is the practice manager of ESMAP at World Bank. Chandra previously led the Global Battery Storage Program at the World Bank. He also leads the Energy and Climate Finance team, which is responsible for mobilizing climate finance for both the GCF and the Climate Investment Funds. Chandra, over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Shamini. Thank you, colleagues. It has been a fascinating discussion. These are things that are not new, but need to be emphasized. Get the basics right, get the planning right, get the permitting right, get the legislation and the subtexts right. It's a fascinating discussion, an important one. I'm not going to try and summarize everything, but PPPs have to play a key role as to unlock the enormous potential of renewables in Africa, especially. But it is going to be challenging, as we just heard, at a number of levels. And at the same time, we have seen in other parts of the world that if you overcome those challenges, the returns can be phenomenal as well. And that is needed, especially if you have to meet what the World Bank president announced a few days ago as 300 million access to 300 million people by 2030, along with the African Development Bank. If we have to meet such goals, these challenges need to be overcome. And SRMI has been leading the charge on this integrated approach. This right from the beginning, get the planning right, get the targets right, get the legislation right, get the structuring, and then you are left with residual risk that could be addressed. So it was very good to hear all that again. And but at the same time, what again it points to is the balance on PPPs. The role of the government is not diminished. In fact, it is critical and needs to be enhanced to get these right. So that we have the right balance, the delicate balance between the public and private. So you have the adequate support on the public side so that you can leverage the private, reduce the perceptions of the risk and get to those financial closures as early as possible. Involving the lenders early is also always helpful so that they are aware of how the process is going, and then therefore in the end we can try to reduce. Last year, the global investments in renewable energy were, I think, 600 million or 623 million or something like that billion. Now the target is for the energy transition. The target is to reach double that, 1.2 trillion by 2030. If we were to get that, I think a lot of that has to happen globally, but also much more so in Africa, which has seen a tiny part of those investments so far. So together, I think we have to work hard and along with MDBs and all the partners to make this viable. So in closing, I would like to thank the panelists once again and the organizers. And it's been a fantastic discussion, and hopefully this paper will rejuvenate the interest and make sure that the governments and partners are on board and the MDBs in order to move this agenda forward. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Chandra, for your closing remarks. Thank you to our panelists and Darren and Claire for their opening remarks and presentations. I hope the rest of you have a good day and good evening. Take care.
Thank you, Shamini, for the moderation of this panel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.